Senator Housakis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Senator Dawson, for your speech. Of course, there was very little in it that I'm in concurrence with, but of course, I do recognize you're the sponsor of the bill, not the architect, and we will have to address this legislation and hopefully trying to strengthen it, clean it up, and try to make it achieve its original objective. Before we get into the actual content of the bill, Senator, I want to talk about process, because I know you're a longtime member of this chamber and a former also member of the House of Commons. And I have been very much concerned with the process of what is basically become secret lawmaking, legislative making in the House of Commons. Have we ever seen a House of Commons committee in closed doors, in camera, propose amendments to legislation which the Speaker of the House of Commons had to rule out of order? And of course, Senator Dawson, I know you appreciate the supremacy of Parliament. Can you comment if you share the concerns that I know Senator Wallen and myself and other colleagues have about the process that was utilized in the other place to come to the end result, which is this legislation that is crawling to come to a finish line here at the Senate?
Senator, sorry, Mr. Speaker, I have to correct you, Ms. Senator Hossa, because these amendments were done in public on the broadcast, CPAC, and in the parliamentary broadcast. They weren't done in an in-camera meeting. There was, obviously, since the Speaker had to overturn the decision that the committee had made to tell the chair to do it that way, obviously the rules were applied, and that's why the Speaker did it, and they reassessed the amendments and passed them again in respect for the structure of amendments in the chamber. Obviously, since there was time allocation, they weren't going to debate all of they had 5 hours to debate. I told you before, 100 amendments, all right? And there was no way they could do a debate on each one of those amendments and respect the 5 hours, since obviously, and it's not being partisan, but the Conservatives obviously had an objective of filibustering the adoption of these amendments, and they succeeded. And everybody sort of got the communications were broken between the chair of the committee, who was overturned by the committee, and the Speaker overturned the decision of the committee. It was not done in secret, and if you're talking about it, because there was nothing secret about it.
Senator Housakis, you have another question?
Yes, Senator Dawson, this is not a question of partisanship. This is a question. For the first time in the history of Parliament, we've had a chair, a Liberal chair of a parliamentary committee who was overruled by his own members in trying to steamroll in an in-camera process amendments, which are absolutely right. Thank God for a point of order that was called by the Conservatives. And again, the Speaker of the House did the appropriate thing. My question now, to turn to a little bit more content, is the Minister of Heritage has constantly claimed, Senator Dawson, that C-10 will result in $830 million per year in additional investments in Canadian culture. Consistently has refused to provide, though, any calculations explaining what formula he used to come up to those numbers. In the House debate this week, the parliamentary secretary claimed that C-10 needed to pass for the government to find out how much money the streaming services are making in Canada. If that's the case, how do they even know how much money the bill will raise, and what are the basis of their promises to the arts sector to come up with figures like that?
Senator Dawson.
And obviously, since the streaming services are not subject to the CRTC disclosure arrangements, some of this is speculation. And again, I will invite you to listen to the briefings on Monday. But more importantly, one of the reasons we're sending it to committee is that you have the opportunity to ask the minister to clarify how it comes up to that number. But basically, one of the reasons the numbers are being contested is that we don't have access to the information of how much. We know how much some of the companies make. How much of it will be redistributed to Canadian content will depend on how much Canadian content is not being paid for at this time.
Senator Housakis, did you have another question?
Yes, if Senator Dawson would continue to take questions.
Senator Dawson?
Certainly, Speaker. Please turn to the Speaker.
Senator Dawson, it seems this whole legislation is based on some kind of form of speculation. So the numbers don't seem to jive because we don't even know what formula has been used. We have heard constantly, and we heard it again in your speech, to trust you, that freedom of speech will not be under risk. I also heard in your speech how this bill is going to strengthen diversity and minority groups, and I, for one, believe that currently the way the Broadcasting Act doesn't do that for minority voices, including multicultural communities. We often hear from the Prime Minister and others in this government that diversity is our strength, and I agree. And we keep hearing that this legislation will protect it, Indigenous voices, LGBTQ voices. However, the irony with this bill, C-10, would actually attack diversity in my definition. What is constituted Canadian content, and therefore will force Indigenous and LGBTQ creators to conform their content to work with who it is the government or the CRTC thinks they should work with. How is that helping these minority voices, Senator Dawson?
Well,
Senator Dawson.
The first reality is that much more money will be at the disposal of everybody, and they will be getting for the first time an identified fair share of it. Because obviously a lot of these laws that were written 30 years ago on broadcasting need to be modernized, and that's one of the objectives of this legislation. So you'll get your answers. First of all, as you know, the minister, and I'm trying to find the chapter, and will be asking, will be issuing directives to the Conseil, to the Privy Council, on giving clear mandate to the CRTC on how it will apply after consultation with the groups, with the industry, and with the people that are involved, basically the artists.
You're always benevolent, Senator Dawson, and I don't want to exhaust blame on you. You're not the architect of this, and I do appreciate you recognize that it's a bill that requires study. So you keep pointing out on a number of occasions that we have nothing to worry about freedom of speech, that the CRTC will just continue to do what they've always done and essentially extend and apply these rules, of course, to other platforms. The truth of the matter is, and you've acknowledged that this is an antiquated Broadcasting Act, and times have changed radically. So the approach is very different. It's not a question of the CRTC regulating broadcasters, traditional classic broadcasters. It's regulating new platforms. Twitter is a new platform. YouTube is a new platform. And young Canadians, particularly, not our generation, Senator Dawson, young Canadians, they've become part and parcels of these platforms, and they're concerned about having their freedoms protected. So I'd like to hear your comment a little bit about how the CRTC will continue business as usual, and we just have to trust them that they will not be infringing upon the expression and freedom of expression of individual use of the various platforms. And my second and last question is, Brian Willey from Calgary is an expert gamer who has over 1 million followers on Twitch. Montrealer Kiana Gomez created a whole business using TikTok. Justin Bieber, I think we've heard of him. Canadian content, but worldwide exposure. Shawn Mendes, Lily Singh. These are all successful Canadians who gained that success through YouTube, through that new platform that traditional broadcasters in Canada are so terrified of. Today, they likely would not be Canadian enough under this new legislation and this can't attempt to narrow things. So your comment on those 2 points, Senator Dawson.
Well, first of all, again, I repeat that the modernization does not apply only to the new broadcasters. It applies to traditional broadcasters as well. The CRTC will get directives from the minister clarifying these issues, and it's going to be part of a process that's in the bill of consultation with the players. So this will be clarified. As far as the hypothetical question of who would have won or lost had they not invented the internet, obviously a lot of these people would not have had the coverage they got. But again, had they been involved in the beginning and they had their revenues guaranteed during the years that this law was not applying to the internet, the billions of dollars that were lost in revenues by Canadian broadcasters, Canadian artists, Canadian distributors would not have been sent to the American companies, but would have been sent to the artists and the producers and the organizations here in Canada.
Senator Lafreda, thank you for your very thoughtful speech, and thank you for particularly zeroing in and recognizing how narrow in scope this bill is, that it does actually impede the ever so important minority voices in this country, like the ethnocultural communities or indigenous people and other groups. I also want to touch upon another issue. I understand that the government would like us to believe that the removal of the clause, the famous clause that's been discussed back and forth of 4.1 is relevant because individual users are protected elsewhere. And how many times does Senator Dawson say, trust me? And I do trust, of course, Senator Dawson, but I don't trust the CRTC, and I wouldn't trust bureaucrats who are not accountable to anyone but the executive. But the truth, and this is my question, is that the content isn't protected thanks to discoverability and the power this legislation gives the CRTC to force platforms to develop and use algorithms that give priority to content based on what they should what should be prioritized. So again, it's right there. It's in black and white when you read this legislation. Content will appear at the top of suggested viewing, not based on what the consumer typically watches or searches, but based on what the CRTC thinks they should watch. So how is that neutral? Would you agree that it isn't neutral, as they claim?
Senator Lafreda.
Thank you for the question, Senator Housakis. And like I said today in my speech, my intention today is not to comment on some of the controversial issues. There's been many. We all know what has gone on for this piece of legislation. But I strongly agree with what was put forward and what Senator Dawson put forward, that an in-depth review is required in committee. And the Senate, once again, has that opportunity to bring the added value it always does, to look at this piece of legislation like it should be looked at, invite the witnesses that we should invite to pursue, according to your question and your concerns and the concerns I've raised in this bill. So the committee, I fully trust the committee. They always do. We have great senators that do great work, and let's wait for the committee to get back to us on their report.
So I will be super brief. I'd like you to comment on a couple of things. Number one, you're absolutely right. This legislation doesn't give the CRTC the power to take down content, but you would agree that it gives the power to the CRTC to order platforms to bury content or to take it down. And my second question to you is, we all recognize how powerful the web and the new platforms are today. Does this, it seems to me the last few days on reflection, does this legislation show the divide between the archaic ways we've regulated broadcasting and where young generations around the world and Canadians are in terms of content?
Senator Simons.
I will answer the second question first because it's easy. Yes. Yes, it does. That is absolutely what it does. I mean, no one under 30 watches television the way you and I did when we were growing up. You and I are of an age. We consumed media in a completely different way than our children do, and goodness knows how our grandchildren will be consuming it. And we need to have a regulatory framework that is nimble enough to respond to the very quickly evolving technical platforms that we have. It's a bit like, this bill reminds me a little bit of the Maginot Line, the way the French dug trenches so that the cavalry horses would fall in the ditches, and then the Panzer tanks came along, and the Maginot Line didn't do them much good. We're regulating to catch up with where we should have been 10 years ago instead of looking to where we need to be 10 years from now. As to your first question, this is indeed my concern, not that the CRTC can take things down, but that the legislation as currently written compels the CRTC to compel the streaming services to privilege Canadian content, to privilege specific kinds of Canadian content with a degree of granular specificity that I think is completely frankly, it's out of the reach of most of those platforms. That's just not how they work. Their algorithms can't be set to work that way. But I think it's really important that we differentiate. I don't think that this bill censors or regulates speech, but I think it imposes nigh on impossible conditions for streaming platforms, some of which may simply pull out of the Canadian market, denying us choice. And we all know that anybody under 30 will use their VPN to get the choice anyway. So what are we doing?
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Housakis, adjournment.
Yes, I would like to take the adjournment in my name, Mr. Speaker.
It was moved by the Honourable Senator Housakos, seconded by the Honourable Senator Martin, that further debate be adjourned until the next sitting of the Senate. If you're opposed to the motion, please say no. Carried. Adopt.